All right, so last week we met up and we talked all about knitting, how to knit stitches, and how to maybe make some of those knit stitches a little bit faster. We talked about knitting English style, Continental style, and lever style. And then I got all these comments and questions asking, what about purling? You didn't talk about purling, and you didn't talk about Portuguese knitting, and you didn't talk about Norwegian knitting. And so we are going to talk about all of those things today. All right, let's get started. My name is Felicia from SweetGeorgia and also the School of SweetGeorgia. We have a hand-dyed yarn company here in Vancouver in British Columbia, and we hand dye all of this yarn that I'm demonstrating with today. We also have an online school where we teach everybody about how to knit and how to spin, weave, dye, crochet, all of the above, anything to do with yarn or making yarn. We talk about all of that. Today, I want to talk about purling and how to actually work purl stitches in the same knitting styles that we talked about last time, but also some new knitting styles as well. Now, here is our swatch from last time. You can see that if you are just knitting back and forth with the knit stitch over and over and again, knitting all the way across, you turn your work and then you knit all the way across the other way, you are going to get a kind of fabric that is called garter stitch. And so this is what that is. So that is garter. Now, if we want to make stockinette fabric, which is this fabric here, where you're seeing little V's on the front of your fabric, it's nice and smooth on one side, it's got like a little bit of a bumpy ridged texture on the back side. This stockinette you need to form by working two different kinds of stitches. First is the knit stitch, and then on the reverse side would be the purl stitch. All right, so this is English style. I basically tension my yarn in my right hand as I do for when I'm knitting. So this is my English style tensioning. And I just keep my stitches pushed up on the left hand needle. I push the stitch up and I tuck my right hand needle into the stitch, throw it around the needle this way to make each stitch. Throw it, throw, throw. Right. And just as a refresher, this is how I knit English style. So with Continental style, I move my yarn to my left hand. So I'm going to tension my yarn in my left hand here like so. It's sort of the opposite of what I do for English style. And then for purling, I'm going to keep my yarn in the front of my work. And so again, I'm sticking my right hand needle in like so, and I form my purls in this way with Continental. Now, this is the one thing that people mention to me over and over again in the comments that slows them down, is this action of taking your yarn with your left hand and pushing it down in order to make that stitch, make that purl. Because this is extra motion that we are trying to sort of avoid, right? Any extra motion is going to sort of slow down our process. You can see the way I kind of wiggle my hands a little bit to get the angles, and I'm using the angles to sort of help get that yarn around so that I don't have to do all of the work with just my finger. So there's a little bit of leaning back, leaning forward, sort of rolling back, rolling forward, that sort of thing. But again, all of this is extra motion that's probably better avoided if you can. All right, so that's Continental purling. And then this is Continental knitting. My yarn is in the back, being held with my left hand. And you can see when we're knitting, we're not having to move our finger. We're not having to move hardly at all. It's just a little bit of a angle, pick up the stitch, and make that next knitted stitch. And so I get that Continental knitting is really quick for a lot of people, but that Continental purling is not. But again, like all things, the more you practice, the more proficient you will get. Now, let's go back to having the yarn on the right-hand side, and then we are going to knit this lever style. So I'm tensioning my yarn again, and I'm going to hold my right-hand needle like a pencil. And again, with my yarn in front, I am going to purl. So this is how I purl when I purl lever style. So you can see my hand is underneath the fabric, and I'm just using this action here, this lever action, to create my stitches. So this happens to be going around like so, and going around, and it's down and back, and down and back. And so that is my lever action going on here. And so this is knitting lever action style. And again, my hand is just going like this to make my stitches. And it's doing pretty much the same thing, right? It is going down and back, down and back, down and back. So one of the reasons why we need to talk about purls and purling is because purl stitches are basically the counterpart to knit stitches. You need these two building blocks in order to do all of the kinds of knitting that we do. You need to be able to work knit stitches, and you need to be able to work purl stitches. So if you want to get faster at knitting, you can get faster at making knit stitches. You can get faster at making purl stitches. You could avoid purling altogether, which is what many knitters actually do. I mean, we often knit things in the round so that we never have to purl. Sometimes we even knit entire colorwork sweaters in the round, so we just have to knit, and we would rather cut and steek our fabric rather than knitting back and forth and having to work purls. This is all for productivity's sake, right? It's just avoid purling. But there are other ways to purl that are in fact faster and more efficient. And so one of the ways that is actually very popular for working purl stitches, and working these purl stitches is probably even more efficient than working knit stitches, is Portuguese style knitting. Now with Portuguese style knitting, what you do is you actually tension your yarn. Rather than tensioning it around all your fingers and everything like that, you are tensioning it over your neck or over a pin. So in this case, here's my working yarn. I could throw it over my neck like so, okay? So I'm holding it like so, and my yarn is always going to be in the front, right? Like this. Or I can also take a little pin. There's much fancier pins out there that you can get for Portuguese knitting. They look almost like jewelry. But in this case, I'm just using this, one of these quilter's little clips, and I'm basically going to clip the yarn to my sweater here. So I'm clipping it so that it can still run through like so, okay? And then with this end of the yarn, I'm just gonna move it into my hand like so, okay? It's just over my middle finger. And so this is going to help me with basically some counter tension on my piece. So I have the yarn coming here, and it's going through this little pin, and I'm just gonna hold the opposite end. So if it gets too far away, I can pull this down like so, okay? And then, like I mentioned before, with purling, my working yarn is in front of me, whereas when I'm knitting, my yarn is very often in behind my work. I'm keeping it to the back. In this case, with purling, I'm keeping the yarn in front. And so with Portuguese knitting, the yarn is it's permanently in front. And so it should be actually much easier to work these stitches. And so all you have to do when we work Portuguese knitting is we are sticking our needle into the yarn as usual for purling. So I'm sticking my right needle in here, and then I'm just using my thumb to flick the yarn over to make those stitches. So I'm going to show this to you up close, but from the front, this is basically what it looks like. With my yarn, I am going to take my little clip here. I'm going to clip this to my sweater or clip this to my shirt. Okay, so you can see, well, so you can see this is my working yarn here in the front. It is attached to a clip, which you can't see because it's off camera over here. It's a clip on the front of my shirt, and then this end of my yarn, I am just going to stick through my hand like so, and this is going to offer the counterbalance to my yarn. And now we're going to purl, and so just like with all of our other purl techniques, we have our yarn in front. We're taking our right hand needle, going into the stitch like so, and then in order to get the yarn to loop around this needle, I use my thumb and just flick it around. And this first stitch might be a little bit tricky, but that's my purl. So I'm sticking my right hand needle into the stitch, and then I use my thumb to flip that around the stitch. And then purling just becomes as easy as that. So there's actually very minimal hand movements here. There's no tensioning of the yarn in my right hand or my left hand. All of the tension is provided by that little clip or the little bend in the yarn. And then I'm only holding the yarn ever so lightly through the fingers of my right hand. So that allows just the slightest bit of tension on the yarn, but I'm not gripping anything or holding anything. And then here, again, because I'm not moving my hands so much, all I'm doing is just bending this yarn over the needle. And that's it. Now let's look at it from the front, and we are going to do the knit stitch for Portuguese knitting. To knit Portuguese style, I have my right hand needle, and normally I would go into my knit stitch like so. I would stick my needle into the stitch from this way and then keep the needle tip at the back. But in Portuguese knitting, to make the knit stitch, I'm going to move the tip of my right hand needle to the front. So I'm just changing the way that they are crossed. So again, when I'm knitting my usual method, I would stick my right hand needle into the stitch this way and have it behind my left hand needle. But in Portuguese knitting, to knit those knit stitches, I'm going to change the direction, and I'm going to have the cross in front. I'm going to have my right hand needle crossed in front of my left hand needle. And then again, with my thumb, I am flipping the yarn over that stitch, over that needle, and then I take my tip through to make the stitch. And so you can kind of see, like, if I was knitting my usual method, my yarn would be in the back and the stitch would form like so. But because the yarn is in the front, it's kind of pulling my stitch forward. Okay, so you can kind of see what that looks like. I have my yarn coming in the front, and it's sort of pulling that stitch to the front. And so that's what it kind of looks like. So we have to work all of our Portuguese knitting stitches where the working yarn is coming from the top of this right hand needle. Okay, and then I'm going to take the tip of my right hand needle and stick this into the stitch, but have the needle tip come out on top of my left hand needle, and then flip the yarn over that needle and then pick the stitch up and off. And you can see again, the yarn is coming from the top of that needle. So you can see we are starting still with the yarn coming from the top of the right hand needle. It looks like it's pulling that stitch forward and you're getting like more legs of that stitch, but it's going to be okay. It's just kind of like a reorientation of those stitches. They've just sort of been pulled forward, but nothing's wrong with them. Now, when you knit in this way, you are tensioning all of your yarn through this little pin or around your neck. That is doing the work of holding up the yarn. And so rather than having to tension the yarn through your fingers and then hold it in a certain way, all of this holding and tensioning yarn with your hand can cause a little bit more tension in your hand. And so if we're looking for a way that's a little bit more ergonomic, maybe less strain on your hands or your wrists, then maybe switching to something like Portuguese knitting would be much, much better, because you're hands-free for the most part. You're not relying on your fingers to hold the tension of that yarn. And so you're letting all of that happen through here. It's almost like actually when we are spinning and we're plying yarn, one of the techniques that we've been working on for the past couple of years is this idea of plying through the rings, which we learned from Kim McKenna. But it is a very similar idea. You're taking sort of loose yarn, the loose singles, and you put it through sort of a bend. You're kind of tensioning it over a bar or a pin or something in order to generate that slight bit of tension on this yarn here. And that is what helps to manage all of the looseness and the loosey-gooseness of the yarn that you're working with. So that is basically Portuguese knitting. I just wanted to show you a brief overview of how that all works and how it's sort of different from the other styles that we've been looking at. The last style that I wanted to look at is Norwegian knitting. And in this particular style, it's actually very, very similar to Continental in some ways, but the Norwegian purl is specifically very, very different and unique. And so I'm going to look at that in a lot more detail. Now, this style of knitting I was introduced to, I don't know, maybe like 15 some years ago. And it is very, very fast. It can be very, very fast because, again, the way that we make faster stitches is by shortening the distance of our fingers and our yarn and the movements that we're making. We're minimizing movement as much as possible. And so with Norwegian knitting, the work happens very, very close to the tips and very close to the fingers. There's no flying fingers, there's no holding, tensioning yarn or anything like that. And so because everything is very close and compact, this can be a very, very quick method. But again, purling is different here, and so that's what we're going to look at here. Now with Norwegian knitting, the yarn is going to be held in the left hand, but there's no sort of fancy tensioning or anything going on this side. The whole idea here is to keep the work very, very close to the tip of the needle. And so the yarn is just held over the front finger, and then we just kind of hold it like so, okay? And if the yarn starts to get away from us, then we just keep it here, and then we tug on the other end and we just pull it down, okay? So if your finger starts to get away from you, then you just take this yarn and you pull it back down, okay? So that is the idea here. There's no tensioning involved. You're basically just holding onto the yarn ever so slightly so that the yarn can flow through your hands really, really easily. Then you are keeping your work very close to your finger, okay? And then with the tip of your right needle, you go in and you're basically working the stitches like so. You are working them basically against your finger. And so if you can see, there's a very small distance where the stitches are being formed. You know, you're not moving your hand in a big way. You're not moving your finger in a big way. There's just this yarn that is being tensioned just over the back. And then you're making stitches in this very tiny little space. It is very compact. It's very, very efficient for making knit stitches. Now, like all things, the more you practice, the more proficient you will become. The other thing is that because these stitches are being formed so fast, you kind of have to really stay on task about getting these stitches pushed up the left-hand needle and ready to knit, because otherwise you will run out of stitches to knit. Let's go to the other side and we are going to purl Norwegian style. So there's going to be some differences when we are purling using Norwegian style. And that is because when we are normally purling, we have the yarn in front. We're working with the yarn in front and it's doing all of this kind of thing. Now, with Norwegian style, we are still going to keep the yarn at the back. And so that is what makes this kind of unique. So in order to do our Norwegian purl, we are keeping our yarn tensioned on our finger. It is in the back. We're holding it in the back the whole time. And again, we are still going into the purl stitch from behind, like so. we are going behind and into the stitch, and then we're coming to the back, picking up the loop of yarn, working yarn, and then going back into the stitch to make that purl. Okay, going in, wrapping, and out. Behind this yarn, wrapping around, pulling the stitch through, and I'm making those purls there. With this Norwegian knitting, all of the stitches are being formed so close to the tips of the needle, like everything is happening there, and then you slide it onto the main part of the needle, so you're getting the right size that you need. But a lot of the distance is minimized because you're working so close to the very tip of what's going on here. Now, with all of these techniques, I wanted to give you an idea of what it looks like when you have to work them both in the same row. If you have to work knits and purls in the same row, what does that look like, and how much do you have to change what you are doing with your hands? And so here I am knitting English style, and I'm knitting 2x2 ribbing, and you can kind of see what I have to do in order to manage that. So I am doing 2 knits, then I'm moving the yarn to the front, and then I do 2 purls, moving the yarn to the back, 2 knits, front, 2 purls, and so on. So I feel like my hands don't really have to change position that much. There is that extra time that's spent moving the yarn to the front or moving it to the back. But for the most part, I don't feel like my hands need to change too much of what they are doing. So very, very quickly, I'm going to switch also to lever style, and I just change the way that I hold my right hand needle. And so again, I am doing 2 knits, and then I switch to the front, and then I knit 2 purls, switch to the back, 2 knits, front, 2 purls, like so. And that is lever style. Now let's switch to Continental and see what that looks like. So in this case, we're starting with 2 purls. I'm going to go 2 knits, purl, knit, purl, so to change from front to back, I feel like I just have to sort of angle my hand a little bit differently, and already it's going front or back. So I'm angling my left hand back, and my yarn is in the back. And then I angle my yarn forward, and the yarn comes to the front. The only part that slows down the purling part of Continental is having to do this with your finger. Now we can try Portuguese. With Portuguese, I have to move my yarn so that I can get it in the right orientation to knit the knits. And then once I'm finished the knits, I need to move the yarn into the front so that I can work the purl stitches. So it's just like English style in that I have to move the yarn from front to back. So you can see that this Norwegian style has the potential to be very quick because you are keeping your yarn in the same position at all times. Rather than having to move your working yarn to the front or the back of your work, it's always in the same spot in the back. And so because it never moves, the only thing you have to change is how you work your needles here. So the hand motions are actually very small. And that is it. So there you have it. There are 5 different styles of knitting that will help you produce your stockinette, help you produce your ribbing, whether you want to knit English style, Continental style, lever style, or Portuguese style, or Norwegian style. There's hopefully some way that you can find that will be the most comfortable, most ergonomic, most enjoyable way of making those stitches. For me, like I've mentioned before, I am auditioning new methods of knitting, and I think it's going to be one of those things where it's like with my electric toothbrush. I had to get into the habit of using my electric toothbrush by literally throwing away all my other toothbrushes. And it's only when you are forced to use this one thing, that's the one thing that you are going to get really good at using. And so what I need to do is just to stop knitting English style or the ways that I've been knitting before. If I'm really going to practice getting much better or more proficient at Portuguese knitting or more proficient at Norwegian knitting, then those are the only styles that I'm going to focus on, and should at least spend, 28 days, 30 days working fully just with the one technique. You really need that muscle memory to build up in your body so that it feels more comfortable to make those stitches. There's less tension in your body. Give yourself a break. Work on this for 10 minutes and then give yourself a break and stretch and all that kind of stuff as you're learning new techniques. But I encourage you to make a swatch like this. Cast on 25, 30 stitches, knitting, purling, stockinette, ribbing, however you want to work it, so that you can start to really get familiar with these different techniques and see what works best for you. We have actually more to talk about with knitting swatches, knitting techniques, and all sorts of things coming in the next couple of weeks. But thank you so much for being here to talk about this and talking about purling today, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. All right, thanks for joining us. Bye for now.